If you want me to change this to a mechanical keyboard talk, I can just swipe it. I'll be talking today about building a Babel 7 processor, but I kind of also call this building JavaScript for JavaScripters, because that is what I do at CodePen. So once again, I'm Cassidy. My handle is @Cassidy. Please talk to me. I need friends. And so if you ever want to tweet me questions about this talk later, you can do that too. So let's get right into it. I work at a company called CodePen. Who knows CodePen? Most people. Oh, yay. OK, great. So I can kind of skip this slide, but a quick blurb. CodePen's an online code playground where you can write code online. It was founded back in 2012. It's been around for a while now. A lot of people use it to demo and prototype projects, make a bunch of cool art with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. We've got millions and millions of pens on the site, and there's also quick blurb. You can get a pro account, and then you can have private pens and team accounts and different modes for coding your pens and more. So anyway, that's what CodePen is for those of you who don't know what it is. But anyway, the bread and butter of CodePen is the pens. And if you have been on the site before, which it sounds like most of you have, this is generally what you're used to seeing. This is the pen editor. And if I were to make a very simple pen with HTML and CSS, you have this nice little simple pen right here. But now we have this JS panel that has Babel enabled. And that enables you to write JavaScript with a nice little flavoring of some very modern JavaScript. And if you can't see very well, I zoomed in. And you might be able to see that we have this funky line right here with pipeline operators. And that is very recently available, and that's the project I'm going to be talking about today, being able to build really modern JavaScript in the pen editor. So let's go back in time to before this happened. We had Babel as a processor at CodePen before, but it was very, very basic Babel. It wasn't the most modern stuff. If you actually wanted to use things like async, await, or anything, you needed to add Babel polyfill in addition to our existing transpiler processor. And infinite loop detection wasn't fully working. And so if you actually wrote an infinite loop on accident, it would very slowly crash your pen. And then if, for example, that pen was on your profile would start to break. And everything was just it would just stop. It was not great. And so we would have support tickets coming in, and we would have to turn Babel off, then delete their pen, or just remove the infinite loop, and then have them go back to their profile. And it was very tedious, not great. So we had to turn off that and add infinite loop detection. And then extra plugins didn't fully work. JSX kind of worked sometimes, but sometimes it would just error out, and it wasn't working the way we wanted to. It wasn't the best. So what we wanted was to fix all of these things. So we wanted the most modern Babel available, which was Babel 7. We wanted access to all of the different plugins, so you wouldn't have to check every single one that you wanted. We wanted it to just work. We wanted it to be extensible, so that way you could add things later, which I can't fully talk about now, but cool things coming to extend it. And we also wanted to add that infinite loop detection, so that way things wouldn't crash and burn if you accidentally wrote while true. So we found this great thing called Babel Standalone. And it looks like this would be the plugin that we needed, and it would solve all of our problems. This is generally all of the presets that it included. And so it had the 2015 preset. It had all of the stages of all of the different plugins that you might need. It had React built in, and Flow built in, TypeScript built in. It seems like it had everything. But unfortunately, it didn't have that extendable aspect that we really wanted. And so we could have that in there, but then in the future, if we wanted to be able to add our own plugins, and if we wanted to, for example, add this infinite loop detection as a plugin, it wasn't working. So we had to do it ourselves. So I'm going to talk about all the plugins and presets that we had to do. The first thing that we had to look at was browser support, because it's something that we have to deal with as web developers every day. CodePen actually stopped supporting really old versions of Internet Explorer last summer. We ended up checking the numbers to help decide which presets and things that we would want to include. And of the multi-million sessions at CodePen in a given month, about 1,000 used Internet Explorer 11. I want you all to guess. You can just shout out. How many do you think used IE 10 or lower of the multi-million sessions? Numbers. 12. So 12 people used it. And so very little. Thus, we destroyed all compilation to ES 2015. People can use let and const and arrow functions and template strings and everything now natively in the browser. And so we just figured, let's not even bother compiling. So we didn't need that 2015 preset. We didn't need to convert a lot of old JavaScript anymore. We could kind of move into the future. And so we started to realize maybe we don't need to use presets at all. We could use every single plugin. We realized we had to be very explicit. Swearing. No. So we wanted to be very explicit with all the plugins that we wanted to include. So by not using just bundles of presets and plugins, we could debug easier. So whenever there was an issue with a specific thing, like optional chaining, do expressions, pipeline operators, we would be able to figure out exactly where those problems were, and it could be with a specific plugin. And then if we have more control by doing it at the plugin level rather than at the preset level with bundles of plugins, we could just plop new plugins in, and then it was as simple as adding it to an array and then adding whatever options that you might need for a given plugin. And so it was nice and extensible by just being very explicit with this list. And this list exists elsewhere on the internet, so you don't need to memorize this. But these are the plugins that we use. We also ended up using some custom plugins, and we built them ourselves. And one of them is a visitor plugin, and the other one is an infinite loop plugin. And I won't get into the visitor plugin much today, but basically it takes the code and parses it and adds Webpack statements and additional compilation that is needed to the code, so that way it can be integrated into the pen editor. So that was one of them that we used, but the infinite loop plugin I did want to talk about. So whenever you're making a plugin for Babel, you need to probably be able to navigate the abstract syntax tree, or the AST. And that's literally just the tree that is developed of your code. And so what we did was we navigated it and detected all the loops that we needed to check for, and then figure it out if those loops ended. And so this is a snippet of this infinite loop plugin. And so it goes through the code, and if at the certain cursor there's a do while statement, a for statement, a while statement, then we have a loop watcher that basically runs the loop and looks for an exit statement. If the exit didn't exist, it would halt execution to save the page from breaking entirely. And then if it did exist, great. The loop is allowed to exist. And it's the kind of thing, too, where you could accidentally write an infinite loop, but then you could fix it and the page wouldn't break because it would just stop the preview until you actually fix the loop. And so it made things a lot easier. And so that was our nice custom plugin that we stuck in there. And the next thing we had to work on was the Babel Config. And so all of the different options and actually putting the plugins in for Babel to consume and send out into the world. So the Babel config determines what is actually returned by Babel. And so like I said, all the plugins, all the options that we might want to put in there. There's docs for it. This is a long link, so you don't need to memorize that. I can tweet that one out. But the docs there have just a list of all the options that you can pass in. And so here are some of the options that we included. And we have a few other options that aren't really necessary for this talk, but code is true because you want to be able to have the code at the end of it. That means you want the direct code result. If you don't have code is true, that usually means that you're taking the processed thing and you're going to pass it into some other transpiler, and we didn't need to do that. So code was true. We also wanted the comments to be true, so that way if you were to export your code and you could get the compiled version and the original version, the comments would still be there. Otherwise, Babel would just cut out all the comments. Compact is false. We didn't want to give someone a minified code when they got their code result. Plugins, that's just, we have our function of all of the plugins that we were returning from our array that I mentioned before. Retaining the lines, that was very important too because of error detection. We wanted to generally say, okay, there's a line on this error, or an error on this line. Ugh. And as the code was changed, we wanted to be able to have the error generally match up with the compiled JavaScript and the original JavaScript that you're writing in Babel, so that way you could kind of figure out where it's happening both on the compiled side and on the original side. And then we don't need source maps because it just loads straight into the pen as one file. It just wasn't useful for us, and you get both the compiled and the uncompiled version when you're exporting it, so we didn't need those. But that was generally what our Babel config looked like. And then we had to pass that into the Babel processor, and this is the thing that kind of pulls everything together. The different steps of that was actually building the config that I mentioned before, processing the code with that config, checking for all of the errors, whether it be in the code itself or if you were importing something that you weren't able to import, and then building a response with that transpiled code and any other metadata that we might need. So processing, that part is just getting the Babel library, building a valid instance of it and with our config, and then transpiling with it. And so we have this function where valid config, we take our options that I mentioned with the code is true, source maps is false and stuff, put that together, and then we take the text input of the user's code in the pen and use that with the valid config to transpile it all together with this Babel transform sync. And then we get our transpiled code, and then we also get metadata from that. And along with that, we also had to handle errors. So we have to validate that the imports in JavaScript are valid if you're requiring some kind of external library. We need to find any missing dependencies that you might need, so we can say, hey, just so you know, you did this, but you need to import this if you're going to use it. And we also just need to make sure that the code can run. And so for that, it's kind of simple. We get that from the transpiled thing that we get from the Babel processor. And here we just get the line. It's kind of that line is kind of silly because the line of the error will almost always be 1. But if the error is not, it'll be that just because of how Babel transformed it. Anyway, we get the line error, and then if the line error doesn't exist for whatever reason, it returns 1. And then we use that line to be able to, on the user interface side, put the error somewhere in your code. And then we get the error message saying like, hey, you missed a semicolon or something like that. And then as we put all that together, we return this JSON that will compile into the ultimate response, which I'll talk about now, the client response. So you get all of your errors with the messages and the line numbers where those should happen. We get the processed code that has all the transpiled things that we need, and then the responses that we could need, which includes all the dependencies that you might have included, that we get the code right there, and then any errors, we just put this in a try-catch block where if it's great, then we don't have any major errors, we can just return the code. And then otherwise, if for whatever reason the processor doesn't work at all, we can build a larger error response, and then that would be more on our end rather than the user's end. Whew, that was a lot, right? Tests. So there's a lot of tests to do next. So once we actually were writing all of this, we had to actually write tests for every single plugin. We had to write tests for the actual Babel part of it. We had to write tests for the client end of actually putting the code in there and making sure that the client returns the right thing, and more. It was a lot of testing. This is an example of one of the tests just for optional chaining. We actually had this little blurb. We had to compile it separately to make sure we knew what the response would look like and have an expected result. And fun fact, Jest is not very good at testing with white space, and so I ended up writing a custom white space matcher so that way it would take the code and then ignore all white space and make sure that it still runs. I put that somewhere open source so you can use it. But anyway, we had to write a test like this for every single one of the plugins to make sure that it worked, in addition to combinations of the plugins, in addition to code that had import statements or require statements. We had to write tests for the Babel level itself. We had to write tests for integrating it with Webpack and actually putting it into the client. It was a lot of tests, but it really made us sure that it was a really robust system. And then after all of this, it was finally time to hook it up to the client. And I did not do this part, but this was just that's when I passed on the processor to another team. It was kind of magical. And I say another team, CodePen is 8 people. I pass it on to another person. But anyway, to hook it up to the client, it was a matter of importing the Babel Processor library as an external package. So we would just install it in. It was in a separate repo, and we installed it into the pen package. We set up a web worker to listen for code changes in the panels, and then every time a code change happened, it would run the Babel processor and produce the preview. So that way it was just kind of constantly listening for what was happening and listening if there needed to be something imported from an external library, that sort of thing. We also added a conditional in the Babel processor that runs the infinite loop detection that we were looking for. So even if Babel is off, we still have that infinite loop detection, so we can still block things from breaking entirely. And then setting up the UI to respond and react to errors, that was taking that error function, setting up where the lines should go, whether it be just at the top at that line 1 that I mentioned or somewhere else in the file. And voila. We finally had our Babel processor. And it included Babel 7, so it had the most modern edition of Babel. It had all of the plugins that we actually wanted without having to have the user import everything individually that they might need. It was an extensible interface for future things. And so in the future, now that we have just this plugins array, we can add whatever plugins that we want. We can build our own custom plugins. And we have a few things in the works that'll be able to use this Babel processor in the future. And then, thank goodness, our support lead was so happy. We have infinite loop detection. And so now people don't have to turn off JavaScript just to unbreak the site for themselves, fix it, and then go back. So this processor kind of fit all of our needs. And because of that, we are able to have this result today, where you can write whatever code you want, use this modern JavaScript, and have a response that you're looking for. And that's about it. Thank you so much.
So why don't we just take a quick seat real quick, and we'll just chat a little bit about, just have a little Q&A between you and I. Or do folks also want to hear a little bit about her mechanical keyboard stuff? Or yes? Okay, does it sound like, okay, it sounds like they want to hear about that, so too. So let's just talk, let's talk about a little bit about your talk. So when this is your first time delivering this talk?
No.
No?
So I've given a variation of this talk a few weeks ago in London, but I shortened it for this one and then kind of sped through it because that was a much longer version of the talk. But I like to speak regularly. I have lost track of the number of events I've spoken at, but this has definitely been a really fun talk because it's one that it's a feature that I was really proud of and that I worked really hard on. And so being able to share it with the world and being able to say, you can use it now, is very exciting.
Yeah, awesome. So if you had time to expand your talk, or you already have expansion of it, what else would you touch on?
So I'd probably go into a deeper level of the actual navigating of the abstract syntax tree. That was a huge learning curve for me, but I think it's something that's very important to know that's something that I didn't even fully realize. Your code is a tree, and you can navigate every single aspect of it, where if this is a function declaration, you can dig into what type of function it is and code in it at a very meta level and read JavaScript. And it was really interesting, and that's something that someday I'll probably give another talk on when I understand it more.
Oh, that's awesome. How did you kind of start learning about the AST?
Documentation.
Documentation.
It was a lot of kind of going through the Babel docs, kind of figuring out what the heck I needed to know. And luckily the Babel team in general, the maintainers of it, are so helpful. Harry Roberts, if you're out there, hey. He was super helpful in answering all the questions that I had, and Twitter is helpful too. And so asking around Stack Overflow and documentation were actually really helpful. The Babel documentation is good, and it also is improving a lot. Just in the time that we were working on it, there were a lot of things that were added which were helpful, and it's a testament to open source.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so in terms of your mechanical keyboards,
Sure,
so is there any that you're building or working on right now?
So many.
Oh.
It's unhealthy how many keyboards I have in my home, but I love them. And so for some background on the Hasbro thing, I had a dream once that I was typing on a Scrabble board, like the game, and I was like, what if I made that real? And then I did, and so I sketched up. I literally like woke up in the middle of the night and just sketched up what I would think a Scrabble keycap set could look like. And then I was like, okay, I can make this a full keyboard that people could buy. It would be so great. Then I realized I couldn't show anyone my designs unless I got permission, and so that involved like months of just cold calling random people trying to get connections. And I ended up getting a connection at Hasbro by posting in a Facebook group, and a person like had a cousin that worked at Hasbro in the past, and then she connected me to an account executive, and then I was able to talk to him, who referred me to someone else who got me the license.
That's awesome.
So
wow.
It was nuts, but super fun. And then there's a website, it used to be called MassDrop, and now it's drop.com. And they were just like, this sounds awesome. And they helped me with the manufacturing side of things, and we sold over 1,000 sets and a bunch of full keyboards with it as well.
Wow, that's so exciting.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, that's all the time we have, but if you have more questions for Cassidy, you can add her at Cassidy, right, on Twitter, or you can find her amongst the crowd. Again, no well actuallys, just questions if you have questions, okay? All right. So thank you so much. Just give her a round of applause.
Thank you.